Lightning split the night sky above Ravenmore as rain hammered the winding road leading to the quiet mountain village of Ashbrook. Villagers abandoned their chores and hurried beneath dripping rooftops when the unmistakable crest of House Whitmore appeared through the storm. No royal carriage had ever ventured so far into the forgotten valley. Horses snorted clouds of mist while soldiers leaped down to clear the muddy path. Then the carriage door opened, and every whisper died. Damian Whitmore, the 28-year-old Duke of Ravenmore, stepped into the rain without waiting for an umbrella. His expensive cloak quickly became soaked, yet he paid no attention. The proud noble who commanded armies and frightened rival lords looked exhausted, his face marked by sleepless nights and silent grief. Instead of walking toward the village square with confidence, he crossed the muddy ground until he stopped before a modest stone cottage surrounded by herb gardens. There, to everyone's astonishment, the feared Duke lowered himself onto one knee. "Please," he said, his voice cracking beneath the storm. "Save my sons." Gasps spread through the crowd. Mothers clutched their children closer, old men exchanged bewildered glances, and young apprentices stared as though they had witnessed the impossible. 6 months earlier, that same Duke had allowed the woman living inside the cottage to be thrown from his castle like an unwelcome beggar. No one had imagined he would ever return, much less beg for her help. The cottage door opened quietly. Selene Ashborne stepped outside carrying a woven basket filled with fresh herbs, her simple gray dress dampened by the mist. At 23, she possessed neither noble elegance nor expensive jewels. Strands of chestnut hair escaped her braid, and tiny stains from crushed plants marked her sleeves. Yet her calm green eyes carried a quiet confidence earned through years of caring for others. She looked first at the kneeling Duke, then at the anxious soldiers behind him, before setting her basket carefully beneath the porch roof. Only moments earlier she had been helping the village baker's wife deliver a healthy baby despite the raging storm. Before that, she had wrapped the injured leg of an elderly shepherd thrown from a hillside, shared warm soup with 2 hungry orphans whose parents had died during the previous winter, and mixed medicine for a feverish child whose family could not afford treatment. Earlier that afternoon she had rescued an abandoned puppy trapped beneath a collapsed fence and gently stitched a deep wound across its shoulder. Her kindness reached every corner of Ashbrook, never asking for payment beyond a grateful smile. The villagers often said the little cottage healed more hearts than the grand castle ever had. Damian lifted weary eyes toward her, ashamed to meet her steady gaze. He remembered their previous encounter with painful clarity, though he wished he could erase every moment of it. Half a year earlier Selene had arrived at Ravenmore Castle carrying bottles of cloudy water, bundles of dried reeds, and carefully written notes describing a strange sickness spreading through streams near the estate. She had begged for only a few minutes to explain her findings. Instead, the palace physician, Dr. Lucian Graves, laughed loudly enough for the entire entrance hall to hear. He mocked her rough handwriting, dismissed her herbal knowledge as peasant superstition, and declared that educated physicians had no need for lessons from a country nurse. Lady Vivian Blackthorne, Damian's ambitious cousin, smiled coldly before remarking that castles should not admit muddy villagers pretending to understand noble affairs. Courtiers eagerly joined their laughter. Damian had been overwhelmed with disputes between neighboring territories, endless petitions from merchants, and the lingering sorrow of losing his beloved wife. Barely glancing toward Selene's evidence, he waved one impatient hand. "Remove her." The guards obeyed immediately. They seized Selene by the arms, dragging her across polished floors before throwing her into the courtyard. Her precious notes scattered across rain-soaked stones. Glass bottles shattered. Mud covered months of careful observations. Tears burned her eyes as servants watched silently from windows. Among them stood young Elias, clutching the hand of his cheerful little brother Noah. Confused by the cruel scene, the boys wanted to help, yet fear kept them frozen. Selene gathered the ruined pages without another word and walked away beneath mocking laughter, carrying only heartbreak and wounded dignity. Now those same innocent boys were dying, and every celebrated physician had failed them. Selene looked at the broken man kneeling before her and quietly answered, "I never wanted revenge. I only wanted someone to listen." After a long silence, She picked up her basket, locked the cottage door, and stepped toward the waiting carriage, unaware that the journey back to Ravenmore would uncover darkness far deadlier than illness itself. The journey back to Ravenmore Castle unfolded beneath gray skies that matched the heavy silence inside the carriage. Damian sat opposite Selene, his hands clasped tightly as though afraid they might reveal the guilt he struggled to hide. She focused instead on organizing dried herbs, folded cloths, and handwritten notes rescued from her small satchel. Every few miles the Duke tried to speak, but the words never came. Selene neither accused nor comforted him. Her thoughts remained fixed on two frightened boys waiting beyond the castle walls, and that purpose alone carried her through the uneasy ride. When the towering gates finally opened, servants lined the courtyard in nervous anticipation. Some recognized the country nurse immediately and exchanged skeptical glances. Others whispered behind gloved hands, unable to understand why the Duke had entrusted his heirs to someone they considered an uneducated villager. Lady Vivian Blackthorne greeted Selene with a polished smile that never reached her eyes, offering courteous words while quietly measuring every movement. Nearby stood Dr. Lucian Graves, his expression frozen between forced confidence and simmering resentment. He bowed respectfully to Damian but barely concealed his contempt for the woman whose arrival threatened his authority. Selene ignored the whispers and asked to see the boys without delay. Damian personally led her through echoing corridors toward the family chambers. Elias lay awake despite his fever, his pale face reflecting both intelligence and exhaustion. Noah slept fitfully beside him, trembling as restless dreams disturbed his breathing. Selene knelt beside each child, checking their pulse, examining their eyes, and listening carefully to every heartbeat. She asked simple questions that no physician had bothered to ask, gently encouraging Elias to describe his headaches and Noah's nightmares. The brothers responded with surprising trust, sensing genuine concern rather than distant obligation. Leaving the room, Selene requested fresh water, clean linens, and complete privacy while preparing medicine. Dr. Graves immediately objected, insisting that palace remedies were superior to country herbs. Damian silenced him with a single glance, giving Selene full authority over the children's care. It was the first time anyone inside the castle had openly chosen her judgment over the physicians, and Graves accepted the decision with an outward bow that barely concealed his growing bitterness. While herbs simmered over a small fire, Selene wandered through the servants' quarters instead of returning to luxurious guest rooms prepared for her. She noticed a stable boy limping after being kicked by a frightened horse and carefully treated his swollen ankle. An elderly maid struggled to carry heavy buckets despite aching joints, so Selene wrapped her wrists with soothing compresses. In the kitchen she helped the exhausted cook treat painful burns from boiling broth before quietly sharing practical advice that eased the woman's discomfort. Even frightened pages gathered around her as she mended scraped knees and told gentle stories to distract them from fear. Slowly, suspicious glances softened into grateful smiles. Not everyone welcomed her kindness. Dr. Graves secretly instructed attendants to misplace her medical supplies, delaying every treatment she attempted. Rare herbs vanished from her work table before dawn. Fresh bandages disappeared without explanation. Rumors spread through the corridors claiming that her medicines relied upon forbidden magic rather than honest healing. Lady Vivian encouraged those whispers with carefully chosen remarks, pretending concern while ensuring every noble guest heard them. Fear proved easier to spread than truth, and Selene found herself judged once again before she could prove her worth. Late one evening she returned to her chamber after checking on Noah's fever and discovered every jar of carefully prepared herbs smashed across the floor. The bitter scent of crushed leaves filled the room, and muddy footprints led back into the hallway before disappearing. She silently cleaned the mess without complaint, mixing fresh remedies from the few remaining plants she carried in her satchel. Her calm refusal to surrender puzzled even the servants who doubted her. Damian observed these quiet acts from a distance. He noticed that Selene never accepted the finest meals until every servant had eaten. She worked through sleepless nights without seeking praise. When Noah cried out from another nightmare, she soothed him with soft stories until he smiled in his sleep. Elias, curious despite his illness, asked endless questions about healing plants, and Selene answered each one with patient warmth. Watching those moments awakened emotions Damian believed had disappeared forever after his wife's death. For the first time in years, hope stirred inside the lonely halls of Ravenmore. Yet Selene's growing confidence brought unsettling discoveries. The boys improved slightly each morning, only to worsen dramatically after nightfall. Their fever followed no natural pattern she recognized. Tiny dark marks appeared beneath their fingernails, fading again before sunrise. No servant shared the same symptoms despite caring for them constantly. During evening prayers she noticed fragrant smoke drifting through the nursery from ornate silver burners placed beside every window. The scent seemed pleasant, almost comforting, but each breath left an unfamiliar bitterness on her tongue. As the children coughed weakly in their sleep, Selene's heart tightened with dreadful certainty. This was no ordinary illness. Someone inside Ravenmore Castle was poisoning the Duke's sons, and the danger was still growing. Sleep abandoned Selene as the realization settled heavily upon her heart. The illness stealing Elias and Noah's strength was no cruel twist of nature but a deliberate act hidden beneath elegance and routine. Before dawn she returned quietly to the nursery, collecting ashes from the silver burners after the servants extinguished the fragrant coals. She sealed the gray powder inside small glass vials and compared its scent with dried herbs from her satchel. Beneath the pleasant perfume lingered the faint trace of a rare blossom known to battlefield healers for its deadly properties when burned in enclosed rooms. Used sparingly, it caused headaches and weakness. Used repeatedly, it slowly destroyed the body while resembling an incurable disease. Selene presented her findings to Damian in the castle library, away from listening ears. He listened without interrupting, studying the tiny vial resting upon the polished table. Every instinct urged him to deny such treachery within his own household, yet the evidence matched the mysterious pattern that had tormented his sons for months. He had ignored Selene before, and that mistake nearly cost innocent lives. This time he chose belief over pride. "We tell no one," Damian said quietly. "If someone inside these walls is responsible, they must believe we remain blind." Selene nodded. "Then we watch carefully, because poison always follows the hand that delivers it." Their uneasy alliance deepened into mutual trust. Damian assigned only 2 loyal guards to protect the nursery, dismissing everyone else under the excuse of reducing noise around the children. Meanwhile, Selene continued treating servants and villagers arriving at the castle gates, maintaining the appearance of ordinary routine. Behind her gentle smile, however, every conversation became an opportunity to observe frightened expressions, careless mistakes, and hidden loyalties. Later that afternoon smoke suddenly poured from the royal stables. Panicked horses screamed while frightened workers fled from the growing flames. Without hesitation Selene rushed inside despite desperate warnings. She caught loose frightened mares, calmed a trapped foal, and guided several horses toward the open courtyard. Just as she reached the final stall, a burning beam crashed behind her, blocking the exit. Before she could search for another escape, Damian charged through the flames, ignoring the danger surrounding him. Covering her with his cloak, he broke through the collapsing barrier, leading both Selene and the trembling horse safely into the rain. The gathered servants cheered, but Lady Vivian watched from an upstairs balcony with unmistakable disappointment flickering across her face. That evening Noah wandered outside despite strict instructions to remain indoors. Drawn by floating lanterns drifting across the estate lake, the curious boy leaned too far from the old wooden pier and slipped into the dark water. His frightened cry echoed across the gardens. Selene reached the shore first and plunged into the freezing lake without removing her heavy cloak. The current dragged Noah beneath the surface before she caught his small hand. Together they struggled toward the bank until Damian dived in beside them, pulling both safely onto solid ground. As Noah clung tightly to Selene, Damian realized she never hesitated when another life depended upon her courage. The following morning Selene insisted upon gathering fresh herbs growing beyond the eastern forest, believing they would strengthen the antidote forming in her mind. Damian refused to let her travel alone and accompanied her with only a handful of trusted riders. Deep within the woods masked bandits burst from hiding, arrows striking nearby trees. Their attack appeared carefully planned rather than random theft. Damian drew his sword while ordering the guards to protect Selene. Instead of fleeing, she helped treat an injured soldier even as the battle continued around them. Fighting side by side, Damian and his men drove the attackers into retreat, though one escaped before his face could be uncovered. Searching the abandoned camp, they discovered expensive supplies no ordinary criminals could afford, suggesting powerful nobles had financed the ambush. Nightfall forced them to shelter inside an abandoned chapel overlooking the forest valley. Rain drummed softly against the weathered roof while a single candle illuminated cracked stone walls. Exhaustion replaced formality, leaving only honesty between them. Damian stared into the flickering flame before speaking with quiet sincerity. "I judged you without hearing your voice. I believe titles instead of truth." Selene met his eyes calmly. "Fear often disguises itself as certainty. You were grieving, but grief does not erase responsibility. Can forgiveness truly exist after such failure? It begins when someone chooses to become better than yesterday." Silence settled between them, peaceful rather than uncomfortable. Their hands rested upon the same worn wooden table, separated by only inches. Neither reached across the distance, yet both understood something precious had quietly begun. Returning to Ravenmore the next day, Selene secretly followed servants carrying fresh silver burners toward the nursery. Hidden behind heavy curtains, she watched Dr. Graves personally refill each vessel with fragrant powder from sealed crystal jars bearing Lord Cedric Holloway's merchant seal. Minutes later Lady Vivian entered, believing herself alone. Her polished composure vanished as she whispered coldly to the physician. "The boys grow weaker. Soon Ravenmore will belong to its rightful heir." Graves answered nervously, "The nurse suspects something." Vivian smiled without warmth. "Then she must disappear before she proves anything." A floorboard creaked beneath Selene's foot. Vivian turned instantly, her sharp eyes locking onto the shadow behind the curtain. Instead of shouting for guards, she smiled with chilling confidence, as though she had anticipated this very moment all along. Selene understood the danger the instant Lady Vivian's smile met her frightened gaze. She slipped through a narrow servant passage before the guards reached the corridor, clutching the small pouch containing the ashes and powder she had collected as evidence. By the time she reached Damian's study, the castle had already erupted with false rumors claiming the country nurse had stolen precious jewels and fled. Vivian moved swiftly, twisting every whisper into another weapon. Damian dismissed the accusations immediately, refusing to believe the woman who had risked her life repeatedly for his sons would suddenly betray them. His refusal only strengthened Vivian's determination to remove Selene forever. Before dawn Selene left the castle disguised beneath a servant's cloak, intending to meet a trusted village apothecary who could confirm the poison's origin. She never reached the village. A black carriage intercepted the lonely road through the hills, and masked men surrounded her before she could escape. She fought fiercely, striking one attacker with her satchel and scattering herbs into the wind, but sheer numbers overwhelmed her. A cloth soaked with bitter fumes covered her face, and darkness swallowed every thought. She awoke inside an abandoned silver mine deep beneath Ravenmore's northern cliffs. Rusted chains secured one ankle to an iron support, while cold water dripped steadily from the cracked ceiling. Faint lantern light revealed Dr. Lucian Graves standing near the entrance, carefully adjusting his gloves with unsettling calm. Lady Vivian watched beside him, her elegant clothing untouched by the damp surroundings. "You should have accepted humiliation instead of seeking truth," Vivian said coldly. "Kindness makes people predictable." Selene raised her head despite the ache pounding through her temples. "Cruelty makes people careless." Graves laughed softly before producing the same fragrant powder hidden inside the silver burners. "No one will question your disappearance once these tunnels flood. The castle will mourn a tragic accident, and the Duke will never discover what truly happened." They walked away together, sealing the heavy iron gate behind them. Their footsteps faded into silence as icy water slowly crept across the stone floor. Selene tested the chain repeatedly until her wrists bled from effort, but the rusted lock refused to yield. Drawing steady breaths, she remembered lessons taught long ago by the old battlefield surgeon who had trained her. Panic wasted strength. patience preserved it. She searched the chamber carefully, discovering broken mining tools scattered beneath collapsed timber. Using a jagged metal shard, she worked tirelessly against the weakened chain while the water continued rising toward her knees. Back at Ravenmore Castle, Damian learned of Selene's disappearance from a frightened stable boy who had witnessed the black carriage leaving before sunrise. The Duke immediately questioned every guard stationed along the northern roads. Their stories conflicted, exposing deliberate lies arranged to delay pursuit. When one frightened servant admitted seeing Lord Cedric's crest upon the carriage wheel, Damian needed no further proof. Ignoring advice to wait for reinforcements, he saddled his fastest horse and rode toward the abandoned mines alone. Every passing mile deepened his regret. He had once failed Selene through pride. He refused to fail her again through hesitation. Rain poured relentlessly as Damian entered the forgotten tunnels carrying only a lantern and drawn sword. Floodwater rushed through broken passages with frightening force, extinguishing several wall torches and leaving much of the mine buried beneath darkness. Crumbling beams groaned overhead while distant echoes disguised every direction. More than once collapsing stone nearly crushed him, forcing desperate leaps across widening cracks. Still he pressed forward, guided only by scattered sprigs of crushed lavender Selene had unknowingly dropped during her capture. The familiar herbs became a silent trail leading deeper underground. Selene finally broke one link of the rusted chain just as water reached her waist. Weak from exhaustion yet unwilling to surrender, she forced herself toward higher ground only to discover the exit blocked by fallen timber. Moments later she heard someone calling her name through the darkness. "Selene." Damian's voice echoed across the flooded chamber. She answered with the last strength remaining. He found her beside the collapsed tunnel, soaked and shivering but alive. Without hesitation he lifted the heavy beams trapping her path, tearing his hands against splintered wood until enough space opened for escape. As another section of ceiling collapsed behind them, Damian carried Selene across the rushing water despite her protests that she could still walk. The mine trembled violently, threatening to bury them forever. They emerged into the storm seconds before the entrance disappeared beneath rock and mud. Outside, Damian lowered her gently onto the rain-soaked grass. Relief overcame every barrier he had built around his heart since losing his wife. He knelt beside Selene, holding her trembling hands without shame. "I thought I had lost you," he whispered. "You came back," she answered weakly. "I should never have let you stand alone." Before either could say more, hoofbeats thundered across the hillside. Loyal soldiers arrived carrying alarming news. During Damian's absence, Lady Vivian had seized Elias from the castle, claiming she was taking him somewhere safe. Noah had escaped with the help of frightened servants, but Lord Cedric was fleeing toward the southern border carrying records that could expose the entire conspiracy. Selene reached into her soaked satchel and produced the precious vial of poison ashes she had protected even through captivity. Damian looked from the evidence to the frightened faces surrounding him, realizing the battle for his family had only entered its most dangerous chapter, and this time there would be no place left for mercy. Dawn broke over Ravenmore beneath a sky washed clean by the night's relentless storm, yet peace remained painfully distant. Damian rode at the head of his soldiers with Selene beside him despite her exhaustion, refusing to waste another moment while Elias remained in danger. Guided by frightened witnesses and the tracks left by hurried horses, they reached an abandoned hunting lodge hidden within dense woodland. Inside, Lady Vivian held Elias captive while Lord Cedric prepared fresh horses for escape. Noah, who had secretly followed the kidnappers after slipping away from the castle, crouched unnoticed beneath a broken staircase, waiting for an opportunity to help his brother. The frightened child remembered every lesson Selene had taught him about remaining calm when fear threatened to overwhelm courage. The confrontation erupted the moment Damian forced open the lodge doors. Cedric drew his sword and rushed forward, determined to buy enough time for Vivian to flee with Elias. Steel clashed violently as Damian met him head-on, every strike fueled by fierce determination rather than anger alone. Nearby, Dr. Lucian Graves emerged from the shadows carrying a concealed dagger, intending to attack the Duke from behind. Selene spotted the movement instantly and stepped between them without hesitation. The blade sliced across her arm instead of Damian's chest. Though pain shot through her body, she refused to fall. Using the attacker's own momentum, she struck Graves with a heavy iron lantern, sending the weapon crashing onto the wooden floor. Startled by the noise, Noah remembered the frightened horses tied behind the lodge. He untied every rope he could reach. The panicked animals burst through the stable doors, charging wildly across the courtyard. Their thunderous escape scattered the kidnappers, giving Elias the precious moment he needed to break free and run toward Damian. Cedric attempted to escape amid the confusion, but soldiers surrounded him before he reached the forest. Vivian realized every carefully crafted plan had collapsed. Her confident smile disappeared for the first time as Damian stood before her with Elias safely beside him and Selene still protecting the children despite her injury. She searched desperately for another lie capable of saving her, yet none remained. Back at Ravenmore Castle, the evidence gathered by Selene finally revealed the entire conspiracy. The ashes from the silver burners matched the poison hidden inside Cedric's imported perfumes, while records recovered from his belongings documented years of illegal shipments disguised as luxury fragrances. Faced with undeniable proof, Dr. Graves abandoned every attempt at denial. Before the assembled court, he confessed that Selene had warned the castle months earlier about contaminated water spreading sickness through nearby villages. Rather than admit a young country nurse possessed knowledge he lacked, he destroyed her reports and dismissed every warning. The epidemic claimed countless innocent lives, and his pride allowed the tragedy to grow. Later, when Vivian offered wealth and influence in exchange for silence, he accepted without hesitation, believing no one would ever discover the truth. The confession struck Damian more deeply than any sword could have managed. He remembered Selene standing alone in the courtyard while guards scattered her notes into the mud. He remembered turning away without listening because pride had seemed easier than patience. Before the entire court, he removed the ducal seal from around his neck and placed it upon the council table. "I cannot undo the suffering my arrogance allowed," he said with quiet honesty. "But I will never again place pride above justice." His words echoed through the silent hall, leaving even longtime advisors unable to speak. Several weeks later, as the castle slowly recovered from grief and betrayal, an elderly nun arrived carrying a weathered wooden chest entrusted to her many years before by Damian's late wife. Inside rested faded letters, adoption records, and journals written during the terrible epidemic. Together they revealed a hidden history known only to a handful of compassionate souls. Selene's grandmother had secretly rescued abandoned children whose families perished during the sickness. Damian's wife had worked beside her, sheltering those children until safe homes could be found. Elias and Noah were among the youngest survivors. They had never shared Damian's blood, yet his wife had chosen them with complete love, fearing ruthless nobles would exploit orphaned heirs for political gain if their identities became known. Damian knelt before the boys, tears shining openly in his eyes. "Nothing written on these pages changes who we are," he said gently. "Blood gave you life, but love made you my sons long before I understood what fatherhood truly meant." Elias embraced him first, followed by Noah, who wrapped both small arms around Selene as well. For the first time since arriving at Ravenmore, she allowed herself to cry without restraint. Months passed, bringing healing instead of fear. Damian returned to Ashbrook not as a ruler seeking forgiveness but as a man carrying hope. Beneath the old oak tree outside Selene's cottage, he asked her to walk beside him for the rest of their lives, not because duty demanded it, but because their hearts had already chosen each other. She accepted with a smile that erased every shadow left by the past. Their wedding united villagers, servants, and nobles in joyful celebration. Instead of requesting jewels or greater power, Selene asked for hospitals open to every family, schools to train compassionate nurses, orphan homes, and traveling medical wagons serving the most remote communities. Together they transformed Ravenmore into a duchy remembered not for wealth or military strength but for mercy. Years later, when a frightened young healer arrived believing no one would value her knowledge, Duchess Selene welcomed her through the castle doors with warm confidence and said, "Come inside. Every great healer deserves to be heard." The words carried across generations, reminding everyone that kindness had rebuilt an entire kingdom where pride had once nearly destroyed it.